All they saw was a single black mother, quietly working her family's farm. A woman who wouldn't sell her land, wouldn't be bullied, wouldn't show fear even when they came with guns and threats. What they missed was the shadow in her eyes, the same shadow that had made battle-hardened fighters whisper warnings in Afghan mountains. Naomi Carter earned her Green Beret by being the ghost enemy soldiers never saw. 27 confirmed kills, and not one target ever heard the shot that ended them. Now, watching these weekend warriors play soldier on her land, she allows herself a small smile. They think they're hunting her. They don't realize she's already turned her farm into their coffin. The Iron Claw militia is about to discover what the Taliban learned too late. Never threaten a mother who knows 1,000 ways to kill, and has chosen to let you live until now. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The morning dew clung to the grass as Naomi Carter worked her way through the cornfield, her calloused hands moving with practiced efficiency. The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks, but she'd already been up for hours. Every movement was purposeful, calculated, habits ingrained from years of training that she couldn't quite shake, even here, in the peaceful countryside of rural Tennessee. Behind her, the sound of dragging feet and occasional sighs announced her son's presence. 12-year-old Elijah trudged along, half-heartedly pulling weeds and checking the irrigation lines. His shoulders slumped with each step, his movements lacking his mother's precision and drive. "Mom," Elijah called out, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Why can't we live closer to town like everyone else? Tommy's family has a PlayStation, and they don't have to wake up at 5 in the morning to pull weeds." Naomi straightened up, her dark skin glistening with morning sweat. She turned to face her son, her expression softening as she studied his frustrated face. "This land is ours, baby. It's been in our family for 3 generations. Your great-grandfather built this farm with his bare hands after coming back from World War II. Some things are worth working for." Elijah kicked at a clump of dirt, unconvinced. "But we're the only black family for miles around here. Everyone at school looks at us weird." Before Naomi could respond, the crunch of tires on gravel caught her attention. Her head snapped toward the sound, eyes narrowing as an expensive black SUV wound its way up their driveway. The vehicle was out of place here among the dusty pickup trucks and farm equipment, and something about its approach made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Elijah, go check on the chickens," she said, her voice carrying a tone that brooked no argument. The boy knew better than to protest when his mother used that voice. A man in an expensive suit stepped out of the SUV, his leather shoes immediately collecting dust from the driveway. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Carter? Randall Briggs from Valley View Real Estate Development." He extended his hand, which Naomi didn't take, causing his smile to falter slightly. "It's Ms. Carter," she corrected, maintaining a careful distance. "And I'm not interested in selling." Briggs chuckled, running a hand through his perfectly styled silver hair. Now, I haven't even made my offer yet. We're prepared to be very generous." He pulled out a leather portfolio, flipping it open to reveal a document with numbers that would have made most farmers in the area seriously consider the deal. Naomi's expression remained unchanged. "The farm's not for sale. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." "Ms. Carter," Briggs's tone shifted, becoming less friendly, more pointed. "You have to understand, this area is changing. Development is coming, whether folks like it or not. And some people around here, well, they don't take kindly to outsiders who stand in the way of progress." Naomi took one step forward, and something in her movement made Briggs take an involuntary step back. "Was that a threat, Mr. Briggs?" "Not at all," he recovered quickly, straightening his tie. "Just sharing some local wisdom. Things can get dangerous out here for folks who don't know how to fit in." Later that afternoon, Naomi's phone buzzed with a call from Elijah's school. Her son had gotten into an argument with Tyler Matthews, whose father was known locally for his involvement with a militia group that liked to play soldier in the woods on weekends. The argument had turned physical, with both boys throwing punches before teachers separated them. In the principal's office, Naomi sat perfectly still, her posture relaxed but alert, as Principal Wallace nervously explained the situation. Tyler's father, red-faced and aggressive, kept throwing glances at Naomi that mixed anger with something else, unease. There was something about the way she carried herself that set off warning bells in his head, though he couldn't say why. "Boys will be boys," Principal Wallace said weakly, "but we have a zero-tolerance policy for fighting." "Tyler called us dirty night," Elijah started, but Naomi raised her hand slightly, and he fell silent. "My son will accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate," Naomi said calmly. "But I trust you'll also address the racial harassment he's been experiencing." The principal shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Now, Ms. Carter, that's a very serious accusation." "Yes," Naomi agreed, her voice quiet, but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room tense up. "It is." That evening, as Naomi prepared dinner, she noticed the farm animals growing restless. The chickens had gone quiet, too quiet, and the horses in the barn were stamping nervously. She moved to the window, scanning the tree line with practiced eyes. For a moment she caught sight of a figure standing in the shadows of the old oak tree, watching the house. When she blinked, the figure was gone. But she knew what she'd seen. Her mind flashed to the hidden compartment beneath her bed, where a combat knife lay wrapped in oilcloth, a remnant of a life she'd tried to leave behind. Elijah sat at the kitchen table pushing food around his plate. "Mom, I'm sorry about the fight." "You stood up for yourself," she said, still watching the darkness beyond the window. "That's nothing to be sorry for. But next time, use your words first. Violence should always be the last resort." The irony of those words wasn't lost on her, given what she knew was coming. Later that night, after Elijah had gone to bed, Naomi retrieved the knife from its hiding place. The weight felt familiar in her hand as she tested its edge. Still razor, sharp after all these years. She'd hoped her son would never have to know about her past, about the things she'd done and the skills she'd acquired. But as she stood in the darkness of her kitchen, watching shadows move through her farm, she knew that time was running out. The quiet life she'd built here was about to be shattered, and the warrior she'd tried so hard to bury was clawing its way back to the surface. She could feel it in her bones, in the way her muscles tensed and her senses sharpened. Trouble was coming, and despite her best efforts to leave that life behind, she was ready for it. But as she closed her eyes that night, one hand resting beneath her pillow where the knife lay hidden, she knew. Sometimes the fight finds you. No matter how far you run. And when it does, you better be ready. The sound of shattering glass jolted Naomi awake. Her eyes snapped open in the darkness, body instantly alert. Years of training kicked in as she silently rolled out of bed, bare feet, touching the cold wooden floor without a sound. The digital clock on her nightstand read 3:17 a.m. Footsteps creaked through the house below, multiple sets moving with purpose. Naomi's mind cataloged the sounds, at least 3 intruders, possibly 4, spreading out through the first floor. They weren't being particularly careful about noise, which meant they either didn't care about being detected or wanted her to know they were there. Naomi moved to Elijah's room first, finding her son awake and terrified. She pressed a finger to her lips, then gestured for him to stay put. He nodded, eyes wide but trusting. She'd drilled him on emergency procedures. Stay quiet, stay hidden, use the emergency phone if necessary. The training was paying off now. The sound of furniture being overturned echoed from below, followed by muffled laughter. These weren't professional burglars. Their movements were too sloppy, too theatrical. This was a message, not a robbery. Naomi crept down the hallway, her movements fluid and silent. She could smell them now. Cheap beer and cigarettes mixed with the sharp scent of adrenaline. Amateur hour, but dangerous nonetheless. Scared men with something to prove could be more unpredictable than trained killers. From her vantage point, at the top of the stairs, she could see 3 men in the living room, wearing dark clothes and cheap Halloween masks. They were methodically destroying her furniture, slashing cushions with hunting knives and overturning tables. A 4th man stood watch by the front door, nervously fingering a baseball bat. Naomi's first instinct was to engage. She could take them all down in under 30 seconds. She knew exactly how she'd do it. Take out the lookout first, silent and fast, then use his bat on the others before they could react. But Elijah was upstairs, and she couldn't risk a confrontation turning bloody with him in the house. Instead, she watched and memorized height, build, movement patterns, vocal patterns. One limped slightly, old knee injury. Another favored his right hand exclusively, probably couldn't use his left well. The lookout kept checking his phone, distracted, anxious, probably new to this kind of work. All useful information for later. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they finished their destruction and moved outside. Naomi followed their movements through different windows, staying in the shadows. They slashed her truck's tires, all four, plus the spare in the bed, then headed toward their own vehicle, parked just out of sight down the road. Only when she was certain they were gone did Naomi return upstairs to check on Elijah. He was exactly where she'd left him, clutching his phone like a lifeline. "They're gone, baby," she said softly, gathering him into her arms. He was shaking slightly, but trying to hide it. "You did good. Real good." "Who were they, Mom?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Just some cowards trying to scare us," Naomi replied, her tone calm and steady despite the rage building inside her. "But we don't scare easy, do we?" Elijah shook, his head against her shoulder. "No, ma'am." The rest of the night was spent securing the house and documenting the damage. Naomi took photos of everything: the slashed furniture, the broken windows, the tire tracks in the gravel. Her military training kicked in as she cataloged the scene. Entry points, exit routes, timing, methodology. Everything told a story if you knew how to read it. Sheriff Marcus Holden arrived just after sunrise, taking his time examining the scene with the bored indifference of someone who'd already made up his mind about what happened. "Probably just kids," he drawled, not bothering to take notes as Naomi showed him the damage. "Lot of that going around lately. Teenagers get bored out here in the summer, start causing trouble." Naomi kept her face neutral, but her voice carried an edge. "Teenagers did this?" She pointed to a boot print in the soft earth beneath a broken window, size 12, military-style tread. "Those are some big teenagers, Sheriff." Holden's eyes narrowed slightly. "Now, Miss Carter, I know you're upset, but let's not make this into something it's not. Could be some local boys had too much to drink, got rowdy. Best thing is to just clean up and move on. And if it happens again?" The sheriff adjusted his belt, his hand unconsciously resting near his weapon. "Well, if you're that concerned about security out here, maybe you ought to consider Mr. Briggs's offer. Lots of nice developments closer to town, better police response times." Naomi held his gaze until he looked away. "Thank you for your time, Sheriff." After Holden left, Naomi spent the morning installing security measures. Motion sensor lights went up around the perimeter of the house. Hidden cameras were positioned at key points, their feeds routing to both her phone and a secure cloud server. She'd ordered the equipment weeks ago, sensing trouble was coming. Now she was glad she had. The work helped keep her mind off the growing knot of anger in her stomach. These people thought they were dealing with a simple farmer, someone they could intimidate with cheap tactics and thuggery. They had no idea what she was capable of, what she'd done in places where the rules of civilization didn't apply. Later that day, Naomi drove into town for supplies, borrowing Sam Torres's old pickup since her truck was out of commission. The general store was busy with the usual morning crowd, but conversations died down as she entered. Eyes followed her movements through the aisles, some curious, some hostile, some carefully blank. Martha, the elderly cashier who had always been kind to Naomi, rang up her purchases with trembling hands. "Heard about what happened at your place," she said quietly. "Terrible business. You be careful out there, honey. Some folks—" She glanced around nervously. "Some folks don't like change." "I've noticed," Naomi replied, keeping her voice light despite the warning bells going off in her head. The whole town knew about the break-in already, which meant either the sheriff or the perpetrators were talking. Either way, it was information she could use. On the drive home, Naomi spotted a dark blue pickup truck that seemed to be following the same route. She took 3 random turns, and the truck stayed with her. Amateur surveillance, but concerning nonetheless. She memorized the plate number before taking a sudden turn that lost her tail. Elijah was waiting on the porch when she returned, his face troubled. "Mom, why don't we just move? We could go somewhere else, somewhere safer." Naomi set down her groceries and looked at her son. In that moment, she saw so much of his father in him, the same questioning eyes, the same need to understand. "Come, here," she said, leading him to the old oak tree in the front yard. "See these roots?" She pointed to where the massive tree's roots broke through the soil. They go deep, deeper than you can see. That's what gives the tree its strength. Nobody can push it over because it knows exactly where it belongs. She turned to face him. "This is where we belong, Elijah. This is our home. We don't run from bullies. We stand our ground." That evening, as the sun set, Naomi patrolled her property. The animals were quieter now, but still on edge. They could sense the tension in the air, the promise of violence to come. In the distance, a single gunshot echoed through the trees. 2, far to be an immediate threat, but close enough to be heard. A warning shot, meant to keep her up at night. Naomi retrieved her rifle from its locked case and settled into a chair on the dark porch. The weapon felt familiar in her hands as she cleaned it methodically, muscle memory taking over. Each movement was precise, practiced, like a ritual she'd performed thousands of times before. Hours passed. Crickets chirped. Owls called to each other in the darkness. Naomi didn't sleep. She watched and waited and remembered other nights, like this in distant places, nights when the darkness held enemies and every shadow could mean death. Just before dawn, she conducted another perimeter check. That's when she found it. A crude symbol carved into a tree at the edge of her property. 3 parallel lines crossed by an X. She'd seen similar markings in war zones, territory markers used by local militias. The message was clear. They were coming. Naomi traced the marking with her fingers, feeling the freshness of the cuts in the bark. They'd done this recently, probably while she was in town. Bold move, coming onto her property in daylight. They were getting cocky, which meant they were getting ready to escalate. Back inside, she pulled out a notebook and began making lists. Supplies needed, defensive positions to fortify, escape routes to plan. She'd been preparing for something like this since she bought the farm, but now the timeline was accelerating. The enemy had shown their hand, marking their territory like animals. But they'd made a crucial mistake. They thought they were the predators in this situation. Soon, they'd learn just how wrong they were. The morning passed quietly. Naomi sent Elijah to school despite his protests. Maintaining normalcy was important, and she needed time to prepare. She spent the day reinforcing windows, setting up additional security measures, and cataloging her resources. Every so often, she'd spot that same blue pickup driving past her property, moving slowly, the driver trying to look casual and failing miserably. She made note of the timing between passes, regular intervals, suggesting a coordinated surveillance effort. These people were organized. She had to give them that. Not well trained, but organized. By late afternoon, Naomi had transformed her farm into a hardened position, though most of the security measures were invisible to casual observation. To an outsider, it would still look like a normal farm, maybe a bit run down around the edges. But every approach was now covered by cameras. Every potential entry point was rigged with alerts. She'd even set up a few surprises for unwanted visitors. Nothing lethal, but definitely memorable. As she worked, memories of her military days kept surfacing. The feel of her rifle against her shoulder during long hours in a sniper hide. The weight of her gear during endless patrols through hostile territory. The sound of incoming fire and the smell of cordite. She'd left that life behind when Elijah was born, wanting something different for him. But now it seemed the past wasn't done with her yet. A truck engine rumbled in the distance, the surveillance vehicle making another pass. Naomi smiled grimly as she finished securing the last camera. Let them watch. Let them think they had the upper hand. She'd learned long ago that the best defense was to let your enemy underestimate you. The sun was setting when Elijah returned from school, his backpack heavy with books. "You okay, baby?" Naomi asked, noting the tension in his shoulders. "Yeah," he said, but his voice was uncertain. "Mom, the kids at school, they're saying things. About us. About you." "What kind of things?" "They say we don't belong here. That bad things happen to people who don't know their place." He looked up at her, eyes full of questions he was afraid to ask. "What did you used to do? Before we came here?" Naomi was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "I used to protect people," she said finally. "People who couldn't protect themselves. And now, I protect us." "Is that why you're not scared?" "Oh, I get scared," Naomi admitted, pulling him close. "But being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what needs to be done anyway." That night, as Elijah slept upstairs, Naomi sat in the darkness of her kitchen, cleaning her weapons and making plans. The symbol on the tree meant she had a deadline now. They'd be coming soon, probably in force. She needed to be ready. A distant engine caught her attention, the surveillance truck making its final pass for the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats. But for now, in the quiet darkness of her kitchen, Naomi allowed herself a small smile. These people thought they were hunting her, but they had it backwards. They just didn't know it yet. The early morning fog clung to the fields like a burial shroud as Boone Walker's truck rumbled down the dirt road toward Randall Briggs's office. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to whiten his knuckles, jaw clenched as he recalled the previous night's surveillance report. The Carter woman wasn't breaking, wasn't showing fear. If anything, she seemed to be getting stronger. The Iron Claw's reputation meant everything in these parts. They'd run off plenty of outsiders before. Usually all it took was one night of terror, maybe a few broken windows, and people got the message. But this woman was different. Briggs was waiting in the parking lot of his real estate office, his expensive suit jacket draped over his shoulder. Even at this early hour, his silver hair was perfectly styled, though dark circles under his eyes betrayed his lack of sleep. "This is taking too long," Briggs said as Boone stepped out of his truck. "My investors are getting impatient," Boone spat on the ground deliberately close to Briggs's polished shoes. "Might go faster if you'd paid what we agreed on up front. You'll get your money when the job's done." Briggs glanced around nervously. "Just handle it. Whatever it takes." "Whatever it takes?" Boone's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Careful what you wish for, Suit. Things might get messy. I don't want to know the details. Just get her off that land." Briggs pulled an envelope from his jacket. "Here's something to motivate your boys. There's more where that came from." Back at the farm, Naomi was checking the morning security footage when she spotted something in her mailbox. The red flag was up, which was odd. She hadn't put any outgoing mail there. Moving cautiously, she approached the mailbox, scanning the surroundings for movement. Inside was a single envelope, expensive paper with her name typed neatly on the front. No return address. She opened it carefully, using a stick to lift the flap in case it contained anything dangerous. Inside was Briggs's original offer letter, now covered in red X's drawn in what looked like blood, but was probably red ink. The message was clear enough. "Real subtle," she muttered, photographing the letter before securing it in a plastic bag. "Evidence for later." The sound of bicycle wheels on gravel announced Elijah's return from school earlier than expected. One look at his face told her something was wrong. His clothes were dirty, his expression a mix of anger and fear. "They destroyed my bike," he said, voice shaking. "After gym class. Tyler and his friends, they used baseball bats. Said it was a warning." Naomi felt the familiar cold anger settling in her chest, but kept her voice calm. "Are you hurt?" "No. I ran." Elijah wouldn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom, I should have fought back." No, baby. She pulled him close. You did exactly right. Running was smart. Fighting isn't always the answer. Even as she said it, she knew fighting was becoming inevitable. After getting Elijah settled inside with his homework, Naomi did another perimeter check. That's when she found the boot prints near the barn, fresh ones from this morning. Size 12, military-style tread, just like from the break-in. They wanted her to know they'd been here, watching. She followed the tracks to the tree line, noting how they'd tried to conceal their movement patterns. Amateur work, but persistent. They were getting bolder, coming onto her property in daylight. That meant they were either stupid or confident. Either way, it made them dangerous. As darkness fell, Naomi's security system pinged. Multiple heat signatures approaching from the north, moving in a rough formation. She counted 8 distinct signatures through her thermal scope. They were armed. She could see the rifle shapes in their hands. Elijah, she called softly. Remember the drill we practiced? He nodded, already moving toward the basement stairs. They'd turned the old root cellar into a secure room, stocked with supplies and a secure phone line. Stay quiet, stay hidden. Call Mr. Torres if things get bad. That's my boy. She kissed his forehead. Whatever you hear, don't come out until I get you. Once Elijah was secure, Naomi moved to her prepared position. The group was closer now, their outlines visible in the moonlight. They wore masks and carried hunting rifles, trying to look intimidating but revealing their inexperience with every movement. She recognized Boone Walker's frame leading them. She'd studied enough surveillance footage to know his walk, the way he favored his right side. He moved with the confidence of someone used to being feared, used to having his way. Naomi waited until they were halfway across the yard before hitting the floodlight switch. Brilliant white light burst from multiple angles, catching the group. In the open, several of them cursed, raising hands to shield their eyes. That's far enough. Naomi's voice carried clearly across the yard, though they couldn't see where it came from. Boone recovered first, laughing. Well, well, the lady of the house finally shows herself some hospitality. His accent was thick, performative. We just came by to have a friendly chat about your future in these parts. Nothing friendly about 8 armed men paying a night visit. Naomi's voice remained steady. Turn around and leave. This is your only warning. Or what? One of Boone's men called out, emboldened by the group's presence. You gonna call the sheriff? He works for us, lady. Shut up, Boone snapped. But the damage was done. That admission would be useful later. I'm giving you 72 hours, Boone announced, trying to regain control of the situation. 72 hours to clear out, take Briggs's offer, and forget about this place. After that, he let the threat hang in the air. You seem to be operating under some misconceptions, Naomi replied calmly. First, that I'm afraid of you. Second, that you have any say in what happens to my land. And third, that you'll be walking away from this if you try to force the issue. Several of the men shifted uncomfortably. There was something in her voice, something that triggered ancient instincts warning of predators in the dark. Boone sensed his men's unease and knew he had to maintain his authority. He raised his rifle, firing a single shot into the air. The chai crack echoed across the property, sending nightbirds scattering from the trees. 72 hours, he repeated, tipping his hat mockingly in the direction of her voice. Clocks ticking. The group backed away slowly, trying to maintain their threatening facade despite their obvious relief at leaving. Naomi watched through her scope as they piled into their vehicles and drove off, their taillights disappearing into the darkness. Only when she was certain they were gone did she retrieve Elijah from the basement. He was pale but composed, clutching the secure phone like a lifeline. Did you have to shoot them? He asked quietly. Nobody got shot tonight, baby. She smoothed his hair. But you need to understand, things are going to get worse before they get better. I need you to be strong. Later that night, after Elijah was asleep, Naomi sat at her kitchen table cleaning her weapons. The familiar routine helped her think, plan. Boone's ultimatum meant she had 3 days to prepare for war. They'd be back, and next time they wouldn't waste time with threats. She pulled out an old footlocker from beneath her bed, its metal surface scratched and dented from years of service. The combination lock clicked open under her fingers, muscle memory taking over. Inside lay pieces of her past she'd hoped to never need again. Her old military ID stared up at her, the photo showing a younger version of herself in full combat gear. Beneath it lay her sniper rifle, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, and her sidearm in its holster. The sight of them brought back memories, some good, some horrific. A mission in Afghanistan flashed through her mind. She'd been positioned on a ridgeline for 3 days, waiting for a high-value target. When the moment came, it had been an impossible shot. Crosswind, extreme range, multiple variables to account for. She'd made it anyway. 1 shot, 1 kill. The kind of shot that became legend among her fellow operators. Now, as she assembled her rifle with practiced ease, those skills were awakening. The muscle memory remained, the calculations running through her head automatically. Range to the property line, wind patterns across the fields of fire from various positions. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her look up. Elijah stood in the doorway, staring at the weapon in her hands with wide eyes. "Mom?" His voice was barely a whisper. "What's going on?" Naomi considered, her words carefully. Her son was old enough to understand that their situation was dangerous, but she needed to handle this right. "Things are going to change," she said finally. "I need you to listen carefully and do exactly what I tell you. Can you do that?" He nodded, eyes still fixed on the rifle. "Good." She began breaking down the weapon, her movements precise and efficient. "First thing you need to know, this house is about to become a fortress. Every entrance, every window, every approach will be covered. I'm going to teach you how to move through it safely." "Are we in danger?" "We're in a situation," she corrected. "Danger is what happens when you're not prepared. We're going to be prepared." The rest of the night was spent reinforcing the house, turning everyday objects into defensive positions. Furniture was rearranged to create choke points. Escape routes were planned and memorized. Naomi worked methodically, drawing on years of combat experience to transform her home into a hardened position. She set up simple but effective booby traps in the barn. Tripwires connected to flashbangs, pressure plates that would trigger alarms. Nothing lethal, but enough to disorient and delay attackers. As she worked, she taught Elijah the basics of tactical movement: how to stay low, how to move silently, how to find cover. He absorbed the lessons quickly, his natural athleticism adapting to the new requirements. "Remember," she told him, demonstrating the proper grip on a hunting knife, "this is absolute last resort. If someone grabs you, you strike here or here." She indicated vulnerable points. "Then you run. Don't try to fight, just get away." Dawn found them on the porch, Naomi's rifle resting across her lap as she watched the sun rise over her fields. The weapon's weight was comforting, familiar. She'd spent countless hours in similar positions, waiting for targets, protecting others. Now she was protecting her son, her home. The enemy was different, but the principles remained the same. Observe, plan, execute. She'd learned those lessons in the harshest school imaginable, and now it was time to put them to use again. The morning birds began their chorus as the sky lightened, nature's rhythm continuing despite the human drama unfolding below. Somewhere out there, Boone and his men were planning their next move. Let them come, she thought. They had no idea what they were walking into. A truck engine rumbled in the distance, probably more surveillance, checking to see if she'd started, packing yet. They'd be watching, counting down the hours, growing more confident with each passing minute she didn't flee. That confidence would be their downfall. They saw a single mother, a farmer, an easy target. They didn't see the warrior beneath the surface, the years of training, the kills under her belt. They didn't understand that they weren't the hunters in this situation. They were the prey. They just didn't know it yet. Dawn painted the horizon in shades of amber as Naomi carried her old footlocker to the kitchen table. The metal box held more than equipment. It contained memories she'd tried to leave behind. Her fingers traced the scratches on its surface, each one telling a story she'd never shared with Elijah. Inside, past the military ID and basic gear, lay her pride and joy, an M24 sniper rifle, customized during her service years. She lifted it carefully, the weight familiar in her hands. The scope had been specially calibrated for her eyes, the stock adjusted to her exact measurements. This wasn't just a weapon, it was an extension of herself. Beside it lay her combat sidearm, a well-maintained Sig Sauer that had saved her life more times than she cared to remember. As she checked both weapons, memories flooded back. Some she welcomed, others she wished would stay buried. The sound of helicopter rotors filled her mind, transporting her back to that fateful day in Afghanistan. She'd been positioned on a rocky outcrop, providing overwatch for a joint operation. The target was a high-value bomb maker who'd killed dozens of civilians. The shot would be nearly impossible. Strong crosswinds, extreme range, multiple environmental factors to consider. She remembered the weight of her rifle, the taste of dust in her mouth, the sweat trickling down her spine despite the mountain cold. Through her scope, she watched the target move through the compound. The wind shifted. Variables changed. Lesser snipers would have missed. She didn't miss. The sound of Elijah's footsteps on the stairs brought her back to the present. He froze, in the doorway, eyes wide as he took in the arsenal spread across the kitchen table. "Mom?" His voice wavered between fear and fascination. "What is all this?" Naomi took a deep breath. She'd known this moment would come eventually, though she'd hoped it would be under better circumstances. "Come here, baby. It's time you learned some things about your mother." Elijah approached cautiously, drawn to the military ID lying among the weapons. He picked it up, studying the photo of a younger version of his mother in full combat gear. "You were a soldier?" "Not just any soldier." Naomi pulled out her Green Beret, the elite unit's insignia still gleaming. "I was part of Special Forces, one of the first women to make it through the program." "Like in the movies?" "No, baby, nothing like the movies." She ran her fingers along the rifle's barrel. "Real combat isn't exciting or glamorous. It's scary, and ugly, and sometimes necessary." Elijah sat down, processing this new information about his mother. "Is that why you're so different from other moms? Why you always notice everything?" "Part of it." Naomi began breaking down the rifle, her movements automatic after thousands of repetitions. "The military taught me a lot of things. How to shoot, how to fight, how to survive. But most importantly, it taught me when to use those skills and when not to." She reassembled the weapon with practiced ease, explaining each component to her son. "This isn't about showing off or being tough. It's about protecting what matters. Sometimes that means fighting. Sometimes it means knowing when not to fight." Outside, a morning breeze rustled through the cornfields. Naomi moved to the window, scanning the perimeter out of habit. No movement, but she knew they were out there somewhere, watching, waiting. "Those men who came last night," Elijah said quietly. "You could have hurt them if you wanted to." "I could have killed them," Naomi corrected, her voice matter-of-fact. "But that would have made things worse. Violence should always be the last resort, not the first response." She spent the next hour showing Elijah how to maintain the weapons, drilling him on safety procedures. He absorbed the information quickly, his hands steady as he learned to check the chamber, verify the safety, handle each piece with appropriate respect. "Mom?" he asked as she demonstrated proper grip technique. "Are you scared?" Naomi paused, considering the question. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what needs to be done despite being scared. The rest of the morning was devoted to turning their home into a defensive position. Naomi moved with purpose, transforming everyday objects into tactical advantages. The heavy oak dining table became cover near the front entrance. Bookshelves were repositioned to create choke points. Every window was given consideration for fields of fire and potential breach points. She showed Elijah how to move through the house safely, teaching him to stay low, use cover, avoid being silhouetted against windows. Her son's natural athleticism served him well as he learned to navigate the new layout. "Remember," she said, demonstrating a silent walking technique, The key is to be smooth. Smooth is fast, and fast is safe. They moved to the barn next. Naomi had already set up basic security measures, but now she added more sophisticated touches. Tripwires connected to flashbang grenades, not lethal, but effective at disorienting attackers. Pressure plates that would trigger silent alarms, fallback positions, and escape routes. This isn't just about fighting, she explained as they worked. It's about controlling the battlefield, making the enemy react to you instead of you reacting to them. As afternoon approached, Naomi took Elijah to the creek that ran along the back of their property. The water would mask their movement sounds, provide emergency drinking water if needed, and offer an escape route if things went badly. See how the current moves? She pointed to the water's flow. Nature can be your ally if you learn to work with it. The same water that could drown you can also hide your tracks, cover your sounds, lead you to safety. They practiced moving silently through the woods, using natural cover, reading signs in the environment. Naomi showed him how to spot surveillance, how to tell if someone had passed through an area recently, how to move without leaving obvious traces. The key is awareness, she said, pointing out subtle signs of wildlife. Everything leaves signs. The art is in reading them correctly. Back at the house, Naomi began preparing dinner, her movements in the kitchen as precise as her weapons handling. Elijah watched her, seeing his mother in a new light. "Those men," he said suddenly. "They don't know about your past, do they?" "No," Naomi smiled slightly. "They don't." "Good," Elijah nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "That's an advantage, right?" "That's right, baby. In any conflict, information is power. They think they know what they're dealing with. Their mistake." After dinner, Naomi continued Elijah's education, this time focusing on knife work. She showed him basic defensive moves, emphasizing escape over engagement. "A knife is a last resort," she explained, demonstrating proper grip technique. "If someone grabs you, you strike here or here, then run. Don't try to fight it out. Just create an opportunity to escape." As night fell, they moved to the porch. Naomi brought her rifle, setting up a casual observation post. To anyone watching, it would look like a mother and son enjoying the evening air. In reality, she was scanning the tree line, noting every movement, every shadow. "Mom?" Elijah's voice was quiet in the darkness. What was it like? Being in the military? Naomi was silent for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "It was hard. Harder than anything I'd ever done. But it taught me who I was, what I was capable of." "Did you kill people?" "Yes. No point lying about it. Only when I had to. Only when there was no other choice. That's something you need to understand, baby. Taking a life changes you. It should never be done lightly." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. "Those men," Elijah said finally. "They're going to come back, aren't they?" "Yes." "And you might have to kill them?" Naomi turned to face her son, seeing the worry in his eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect you, to protect our home. But killing isn't the goal. The goal is to make them understand that attacking us isn't worth the cost." Later that night, after Elijah was asleep, Naomi continued her preparations. She set up additional security measures, established fallback positions, cached supplies at key points around the property. Every movement was calculated, every decision based on years of combat experience. She thought about the men who'd threatened them, about Boone Walker and his wannabe militia. They played at being soldiers, probably spent weekends in the woods, playing war games. But they'd never faced real combat, never made the hard choices that came with actual warfare. They thought numbers and intimidation would win the day. They didn't understand that real combat was about skill, about discipline, about being willing to do whatever it took to complete the mission. Dawn found her on the porch again, rifle across her lap, watching the sun rise over her fields. In less than 48 hours, Boone's ultimatum would expire. They'd come in force, expecting to find a frightened woman ready to run. Instead, they'd find a trained killer who'd spent years perfecting the art of warfare. A woman who'd made impossible shots, who'd survived situations that would break most. Soldiers. A mother protecting her child and her home. Let them come, she thought, checking her weapon one last time. They'd learn soon enough what it meant to threaten a Green Beret. The morning birds began their chorus as the sky lightened. Somewhere out there, Boone and his men were planning their assault. They had no idea they were walking into a trap set by one of the military's most lethal operators. Their ignorance would be their downfall. They thought they were the predators in this situation, but they were wrong. Dead wrong. And soon, they'd understand just how badly they'd miscalculated. The night air carried the promise of violence as Naomi watched 3 vehicles approach her farm through her rifle scope. Boone hadn't waited for his ultimatum to expire, typical of an undisciplined enemy. The trucks moved slowly, headlights off, trying to be stealthy but betraying their position with every engine rumble. From her elevated position in the barn's hayloft, Naomi had a clear view of the entire approach. She'd prepared this spot carefully, ensuring multiple escape routes and clear fields of fire. Elijah was secure in the basement bunker, armed with a satellite phone and strict instructions to call Sam Torres if things went sideways. The vehicles stopped just beyond her property line. In the moonlight, she counted 12 men emerging from the trucks. They moved with fake military precision, clearly mimicking tactics they'd seen in movies or learned during weekend warrior exercises. Their weapons were a mix of hunting rifles and semi-automatic firearms, dangerous enough but wielded without real training. Naomi controlled her breathing, falling into the familiar rhythm of combat breathing she'd learned years ago. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. Her heart rate slowed, her focus sharpened. Time seemed to stretch as she watched. Boone direct his men with hand signals that would have made her drill sergeant cry. Moving to position 1, a voice crackled over her earpiece, one of the surveillance cameras picking up their radio chatter. They weren't even using proper radio. Discipline. Roger that. Eyes on the house, another voice responded. No movement. Naomi allowed herself a small smile. They were looking at the house, expecting her to be hiding inside. They hadn't even considered the barn as a fighting position. Amateur hour. She watched through her scope as Boone sent a scout. Ahead, young guy, probably early 20s, moving with the exaggerated caution of someone who'd learned tactics from video games. He was headed straight for one of her prepared positions. The suppressed shot from her rifle made less noise than a hand clap. The scout dropped without a sound, tranquilizer dart finding its mark in his neck. She'd chosen non-lethal ammunition. For the first engagement, dead bodies would bring complications she didn't need yet. Jimmy, you in position? Boone's voice crackled over the radio. No response. Check on Anderson, Boone commanded. 2 more men moved forward, weapons raised. They found their unconscious companion and immediately broke proper tactical formation, clustering together and presenting a perfect target. Naomi resisted the urge to take the shot. Let them bunch up. Let them get nervous. The group moved toward the barn, exactly as she'd predicted. The building was the obvious choice for anyone thinking tactically. Clear lines of sight to the house, multiple exit points, elevated firing positions. Of course, that's why she'd prepared it specially for them. Barn's clear, one of them called after a cursory check of the ground floor. Moving to sweep the house. They'd missed the tripwire by inches. Naomi tracked them through her scope as they approached the house in a ragged formation. 3 men peeled off to check the back while the main group headed for the front door. The first explosion caught them completely by surprise. A flashbang grenade, non-lethal but extremely effective, detonated in the barn just as the rear group reached the back porch. The concussion and brilliant flash sent 2 men sprawling, their curses filling the radio channel. Chaos erupted as the men lost their nerve and began firing wildly at shadows. Boone's voice rose above the confusion, trying to restore order, but his men were already scattered and disoriented. Naomi moved like a ghost through her prepared routes, taking advantage of the confusion. Another suppressed shot dropped a man trying to flank the house. A third found its mark in the shoulder of one attempting to reach the fallen scout. "We're under fire!" someone screamed into the radio. "Where's it coming from?" Boone's response was drowned out by more gunfire as his men shot at anything that moved. They were burning through ammunition at an unsustainable rate, making rookie mistakes that would get them killed in a real combat situation. Naomi relocated smoothly to her second firing position, just as she'd practiced countless times. The muscle, memory from years of combat experience took over. Move, shoot, move again. Never stay in one place long enough to become a target. Through her night vision goggles, she watched Boone attempting to rally his men. He fired his rifle toward the house, the muzzle flash ruining his night vision and revealing his position. The round struck nothing but empty air and reinforced walls. "Stop wasting ammo," Boone's voice carried across the property. "Form up on me, defensive positions." But his men were beyond listening. The darkness, the unseen attacker, the precision of the hits. It was all too much for their weekend warrior bravado. 2 more flashbangs detonated near their vehicles, and that was the breaking point. Fall. "Back!" someone shouted. "She's got the whole place rigged!" Men began running for the trucks, tactical formation forgotten. Naomi could have dropped half of them before they reached their vehicles, but that wasn't the objective. The goal was to send a message, not start a war. Boone stood his ground, firing another ineffective burst at the house. "Get back here, you cowards!" he screamed at his retreating men. "It's one woman." A round from Naomi's rifle kicked up dirt near his feet, a warning shot that sent him scrambling for cover. She could have taken the shot, ended it right there, but dead bodies would bring investigations, complications she didn't need. Through her scope, she watched the fury and frustration play across Boone's face as he realized his attack had failed completely. His men were retreating in disorder, leaving their wounded behind, their fearsome reputation in tatters. 2 of the injured tried to crawl toward the vehicles. Naomi let them go. The third, the scout she'd dropped first, was still unconscious. She'd retrieve him once the others were gone. "This isn't over," Boone shouted into the darkness as he backed toward his truck. "You hear me? This is just the beginning." The vehicles peeled out in a spray of gravel, their taillights disappearing into the night. Naomi maintained her position for another 15 minutes, ensuring they weren't trying to circle back. Only when she was certain they were gone did she move to check on their unconscious man. He was starting to stir as she approached, young, probably local, with a cheap tactical vest and surplus store equipment. His eyes widened with fear as she emerged from the shadows. Who the hell are you?" he managed to whisper, before the sedative pulled him back under. Naomi zip-tied, his hands and feet before calling the sheriff's office. Let them deal with him. He'd wake up with a headache and a story that would spread through the local militia ranks like wildfire. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air as she did one final perimeter check. Everything had gone according to plan. No casualties, minimal property damage, and a clear message sent. This farm was not an easy target. Inside the house, she found Elijah exactly where she'd left him, the satellite phone clutched in his hands. "Is it over?" he asked, as she helped him out of the bunker. "For now," Naomi replied, already mentally preparing for what would come next. Boone wouldn't take this humiliation lightly. He'd be back, with more men and better weapons. But now he knew he was dealing with someone who could fight back. Sheriff Holden arrived first, his deputy close behind. He took in the scene with barely concealed anger, shell casings from the gang's wild firing, scorch marks from the flashbangs, and one unconscious would-be attacker. "This is getting out of hand, Ms. Carter," he said, trying to sound authoritative. If I just sell, your friends wouldn't have to resort to armed assault." Naomi cut him off. "Be careful, Sheriff. You don't want to be on record suggesting that, do you?" Holden's face reddened. "These boys were probably just what? Having target practice on my property? With live ammunition and tactical gear?" Naomi's voice carried an edge that made the deputy take a step back. "You've got one of them right there. Why don't you ask him what they were doing on my land?" "You can't prove anything," Holden muttered, but his bluster was fading. "Far as I'm concerned, this was just some kids causing trouble. Then you won't mind if I handle any future kids the same way." Naomi met his gaze steadily. "And Sheriff, next time, I won't let them leave." The threat hung in the air between them. Holden looked away first, turning his attention to the unconscious man. They both knew he'd have to arrest him. There were too many shell casings, too much evidence to ignore completely. As the police cars pulled away, Naomi began cleaning up the battlefield. She collected shell casings, documented impact points, and retrieved her spent tranquilizer darts. Everything could be evidence if things escalated further. Elijah helped, his movements becoming more confident as the adrenaline wore off. They'll come back, won't they? Yes, Naomi didn't bother sugarcoating it, but next time we'll be even more prepared. The rest of the night was spent reinforcing their defenses. Naomi knew Boone would analyze his failure, try to figure out what went wrong. He'd come up with new tactics, bring more firepower, but he still wouldn't understand what he was really dealing with. She'd fought against actual terrorists, people who'd spent their entire lives in combat. Boone's wannabe militia didn't stand a chance against someone with her training and experience. But that could make them more dangerous. Wounded pride could drive men to desperate actions. As dawn approached, Naomi stationed herself on the porch, rifle ready. She'd seen the same pattern in combat zones around the world. The first attack was usually a test, a way to probe defenses and assess capabilities. The real assault would come later, after they'd licked their wounds and rebuilt their courage. Elijah brought her coffee, settling into the chair beside her. They watched the sun rise together, the morning birds beginning their chorus, as if nothing had happened during the night. I wasn't scared, Elijah said suddenly. I mean, I was, but I knew you'd handle it. Naomi reached over and squeezed his hand. Being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what needs to be done anyway. Like you did in the military? Like I'm doing now. She scanned the tree line, more out of habit than necessity. Protecting what matters. The morning wore on, bringing curious neighbors drawn by rumors of gunfire and explosions. Naomi watched them drive past slowly, their faces a mix of fear and fascination. By nightfall, the whole town would be buzzing with stories about what had happened at the Carter farm. Let them talk. Let the story spread. Maybe it would make others think twice before joining Boone's crusade. But she knew better than to count on it. Men like Boone didn't back down easily, especially when money and pride were involved. She spent the morning gathering intelligence through her own network of contacts. The local diner's waitress, who'd served breakfast to some of Boone's shaken men. The gas station attendant who'd overheard them arguing about what went wrong. The feed store owner who'd watched Boone make angry phone calls in the parking lot. Every piece of information helped build a clearer picture. Boone was furious, embarrassed, and determined to regain his reputation. He was calling in favors, reaching out to other militia groups in the region. The next attack would be bigger, better, organized, but that's what he didn't understand. It wasn't about numbers or firepower. It was about skill, about experience, about the willingness to do whatever it took to complete the mission. Naomi had spent years perfecting the art of combat. She'd made impossible shots, survived situations that would break most soldiers. She'd learned her trade in the harshest school imaginable, against enemies who'd been fighting their entire lives. Boone and his men were about to learn a harsh lesson about the difference between playing soldier and being one. The militia compound buzzed with activity as Boone Walker paced before his assembled men. 20 new faces mixed with his regulars, drawn by promises of easy money and the chance to put down what Boone called an uppity troublemaker. The morning sun cast long shadows through the trees as weapons were distributed and plans were made. She made us look like amateurs, Boone growled, his wounded pride evident in every word. That ends today. We've got support now. Real fighters who know what they're doing. In the back of the group, a man in surplus military gear snorted. Derek Mason had served 2 years in the Army before being discharged for disciplinary issues, but he acted like he'd led special forces. Your boys went in blind, no real plan. That's not how we operate. Randall Briggs stood off to the side, his expensive suit out of place among the tactical gear and weapons. His normally perfect hair was disheveled, his face showing the strain of sleepless nights. Whatever you're going to do it fast. My investors are losing patience. Boone spat on the ground. Worry about your end of things, Suit. We'll handle the wet work. Back at the farm, Naomi sensed the changing dynamics before she saw any evidence. The morning felt different. The birds were quieter, the air heavier with tension. She'd felt similar shifts before firefights in Afghanistan. That stillness before all hell broke loose. She was checking the perimeter cameras when the first sign of escalation came. The barn erupted in flames, the old wood catching quickly in the morning. Heat. The fire spread faster than natural, accelerated by gasoline or something similar. Through her scope, Naomi caught glimpses of movement in the tree line, someone watching their handiwork. She could have taken the shot, but that's what they wanted. They were testing her, trying to draw her out. The local fire department took their time responding, arriving only after the barn was mostly ash. Chief Roberts avoided meeting Naomi's eyes as his men half-heartedly sprayed water on the smoldering ruins. "Probably electrical," he mumbled, not even pretending to investigate. "Old barns like this, wiring goes bad." "Electrical fires don't smell like gasoline, Chief," Naomi replied calmly. "And they don't start when the power's been cut for 3 days." The chief shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Ms. Carter, maybe it's time to consider—" "Finish that sentence," Naomi cut him off. "I'd love to hear a public servant suggest I give into terrorist demands." He left quickly after that, leaving Naomi to survey the destruction. The barn had been more than just a building. It had been part of her defensive setup, a prepared position with clear lines of sight. Now she'd have to adapt, adjust her plans. Later that afternoon, Naomi drove into town for supplies, taking Elijah with her rather than leaving him alone at the farm. The gas station was their first stop. As Naomi filled the truck, she noticed a van circling the block, moving too slowly to be casual traffic. Inside the store, she positioned Elijah near the back, where she could keep him in sight while watching the entrance. The clerk, Tommy's younger brother, kept glancing nervously at the door. The attack came fast, 3 men rushing in, faces covered, moving with more precision than Boone's usual thugs. They went straight for Elijah, ignoring the cash register entirely. The first man reached for her son with gloved hands. Naomi moved without hesitation, years of close-quarters combat training taking over. Her elbow caught him in the throat, crushing his windpipe before he could shout a warning. The second attacker managed to draw a knife, but Naomi was already inside his guard. She broke his wrist with one sharp movement, then drove her knee into his liver. He dropped, retching. The third man showed more sense than his companions, turning to run. But Naomi had positioned herself between them and the door when they entered. She caught him with a sweep kick that sent him sprawling, then finished him with a precise strike, to the base of his skull. The entire fight lasted less than 10 seconds. 3 bodies lay groaning or unconscious on the floor, taken down with mechanical efficiency by a woman they'd thought would be an easy target. "Jesus Christ," the clerk whispered, his phone halfway to his ear. What do I tell the cops?" "Tell them there was an attempted robbery," Naomi replied calmly, checking on Elijah. "Tell them the suspects fled. Unless you want to explain why you knew they were coming." The clerk's face went pale. He lowered the phone. Back in the truck, Elijah was quiet for a long moment. "That was different from the farm," he finally said. "You didn't give them a chance." "They came for you," Naomi replied, her voice hard. "That changes the rules." She drove carefully, taking a winding route back to the farm to ensure they weren't followed. Her mind was already analyzing the attack. Those men had been different. Better. Trained, more coordinated. Boone was bringing in outside talent, escalating the situation. At home, Naomi found more evidence of surveillance. Boot prints in the soft earth near the creek. Cigarette butts by the fence line. They weren't even trying to hide their presence anymore. The sound of an approaching vehicle brought her to alert, but it was just Sheriff Holden's patrol car. He stepped out, trying to project authority he didn't have. "Got reports of a disturbance. At the gas station," he said. "Wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "Just an attempted robbery," Naomi replied. "Guess they picked the wrong target." 3 men in the hospital would agree. Holden's face darkened. "This has to stop, Ms. Carter. People are going to get hurt." "People are already getting hurt, Sheriff." My barn burned down this morning, or did you miss that report? You can't prove anything. I can prove a lot more than you'd like. Naomi met his gaze steadily, including which numbered account Briggs uses to pay you off. That hit home. Holden's face went red, then pale. You're making enemies you can't handle. No, Sheriff. They're making an enemy they don't understand. After Holden left, Naomi began preparing for the next phase. The attempted kidnapping meant they were getting desperate, willing to take bigger risks. That made them more dangerous. She called Sam Torres, an old teammate from her Special Forces days. His voice was thick with sleep. She'd forgotten about the time difference. Go for Torres. Sam, it's Naomi. Remember that favor you owe me from Kandahar? There was a pause, then the sound of movement. The one where you saved my ass from those Taliban fighters? Or the one where you talked me out of marrying that stripper in Bangkok? Both. That bad, huh? She could hear him getting serious. What's the situation? Naomi gave him a quick rundown. Sam whistled low when she finished. Local militia plus hired muscle, corrupt cops, and they're targeting your kid? Papers rustled. In the background. Give me 48 hours. I know some people who owe me favors. Just like old times? Better. These idiots aren't Taliban. They just think they're hard because they play soldier on the weekends. Sam's voice carried a predator's grin. Time to show them what real operators can do. After hanging up, Naomi focused on fortifying their position. The barn's destruction meant adjusting her defensive plans. She set up new firing positions, established alternate escape routes, and prepared for any contingency. Through her contacts in town, she learned that Boone was gathering his forces at an old hunting cabin in the hills. More vehicles arriving daily, carrying men with military-style gear and serious weapons. The locals were getting nervous, sensing the coming violence. Martha from the general store passed her a note with her groceries. Big meeting at the cabin tonight. Lots of strangers. Be careful. Naomi spent the afternoon moving Elijah to a secure location, a reinforced storm shelter near the creek, concealed by natural cover and accessible only by hidden paths. She stocked it with food, water, and emergency supplies. I don't want to hide, Elijah protested. I want to help. You help by staying safe, Naomi replied, showing him how to secure the shelter's entrance. I can't fight effectively if I'm worried about you. That evening, Naomi observed the hunting cabin through her scope. The activity suggested a major operation being planned. Men moved with purpose, checking weapons, studying maps. This wouldn't be like the last attack. This would be coordinated, professional. Through her directional microphone, she caught fragments of conversation. Plans for a siege, talk of cutting power and phone lines, references to superior firepower and overwhelming force. Let them plan, she thought. Let them think their numbers and weapons would make the difference. They still didn't understand what they were dealing with. A truck arrived carrying serious hardware, military-grade weapons that definitely weren't legal for civilian use. Naomi photographed everything, documenting each face, each vehicle, each weapon. Evidence for later, assuming any of them survived what was coming. The sun was setting when she spotted Randall Briggs's car pulling up to the cabin. The real estate developer looked nervous as he carried a briefcase inside. Blood money, probably. 30 pieces of silver for the modern age. Naomi withdrew carefully, leaving no trace of her presence. Back at the farm, she began final preparations. Weapons were cleaned and positioned. Ammunition was distributed to strategic points. Medical supplies were checked and rechecked. She thought about the men at the cabin, planning their assault. They had numbers, firepower, and local support. Their minds that made them invincible. But Naomi had something they didn't. Decades of real combat experience, not just weekend training exercises. In Afghanistan, she'd learned that superior numbers meant nothing against a skilled opponent fighting on prepared ground. She'd seen entire Taliban units broken by smaller, better-trained forces. Now she would teach that lesson again. The night deepened as Naomi moved through her defensive positions, checking and rechecking every detail. Each window was covered, each approach was mined with non-lethal surprises, each fallback position was prepared. She thought about the men, who'd tried to grab Elijah, about the precision in their movements that marked them as professionals. Hired guns brought in to supplement Boone's local muscle. That meant they'd have actual tactical knowledge, real combat experience. Good. Let them come with their training and their weapons. Let them think they knew what they were doing. They'd learn the difference between fighting civilians and engaging. A trained operator on her own ground. The moon rose over the fields, casting sharp shadows across the land. Somewhere out there, Boone and his men were finishing their plans, confident in their superior numbers and firepower. They'd attack at dawn probably, thinking to catch her off guard. Naomi smiled in the darkness. Dawn attacks were predictable, amateur. Real combat happened in the gray hours, when human alertness was at its lowest. She'd learned that lesson the hard way in places these men couldn't find on a map. She checked her weapons one final time, each movement automatic after countless repetitions. The rifle's weight was familiar in her hands, the scope perfectly aligned to her eye. This weapon had served her well in combat zones around the world. Now it would help her defend her home. Let them come with their plans and their numbers. Let them think their fancy weapons and tactical gear made them warriors. She'd show them what real combat looked like, teach them why the Green Berets were feared even by hardened fighters. The night air carried the scent of rain as Naomi completed her preparations. A storm was coming, both literally and figuratively. But storms were good. They masked movement, complicated operations, separated the professionals from the amateurs. She thought about Elijah, secure in his hideout. Everything she did was for him, to give him a future free from fear and violence. The irony wasn't lost on her, using violence to create peace. But sometimes that was necessary. The stars wheeled overhead as Naomi settled into her primary position. Years of training had taught her patience, the ability to remain motionless for hours while waiting for the perfect moment. She could outwait them, outlast them, outfight them. Let them come with their siege plans and their overwhelming force. She'd show them why even the Taliban had learned to fear the shadow of a lone sniper in the night. Thunder rolled across the darkened sky as Boone's convoy approached the farm. Through her night vision scope, Naomi counted 12 vehicles moving, in formation along the access road. Their headlights were off, engines muffled. Someone with actual tactical experience was coordinating this assault. From his concealed position in the tree line, Elijah keyed his radio twice, the signal they'd agreed upon. He'd spotted 3 more vehicles approaching from the back road, trying to cut off potential escape routes. Smart, but expected. "I see them, baby," Naomi whispered into her throat mic. "Remember what I told you. Stay hidden, stay quiet, no matter what happens." The first drops of rain began to fall as the vehicles took up positions around the farm. Lightning flashed, illuminating dozens of armed men deploying in tactical formations. Their movements were more disciplined this time. The new mercenaries were obviously taking charge. Through her thermal scope, Naomi identified Boone in the lead vehicle, gesturing as he directed his forces. Beside him sat a man she didn't recognize, but his bearing and the way others deferred to him marked him as one of the professional soldiers they'd hired. "Command, this is Eagle 1. A voice crackled over the radio frequency she'd tapped. "All units in position. No movement from the target building. Roger that, Eagle 1. Green light for Phase 1. Naomi allowed herself a grim smile. They were using proper radio protocols now, but their operational security was still amateur. It had taken her less than an hour to identify and hack their frequency. The first shots came from a designated marksman. They'd positioned in a hunter's blind about 400 yards out. The round struck her upstairs windows with precision, but found only empty rooms. She'd replaced the glass days ago with reinforced plastic that would stop anything short of a high-powered rifle round. "Sniper team. No response from target," the spotter reported. "Buildings appear empty. Proceed with Phase 2, the commander ordered. "Breach teams, move up." Lightning flashed again as 2 teams of 4 men each approached the house from different angles. They moved well, covering each other's advances, watching their sectors. These weren't Boone's local thugs. These were trained professionals. Naomi let them get closer, waiting for the perfect moment. The rain was falling steadily now, reducing visibility and masking sounds. Nature itself was providing tactical advantages. The first team reached her front porch. One man began setting up a breaching charge while his teammates provided coverage. Standard operating procedure for a professional tactical unit. That's when Naomi triggered her first surprise. The explosives she'd hidden in the porch support columns detonated simultaneously, collapsing the entire structure. 2 men went down, immediately, caught in the falling debris. The others scrambled for cover, suddenly unsure of their position. "Contact! Contact!" someone screamed over the radio. "The porch was rigged! Hold position!" the commander ordered. "Medical team, stand by!" His voice cut off as Naomi's second surprise activated. The perimeter lights she'd installed burst to life, but these weren't ordinary floodlights. They were military-grade strobes, designed to disorient and confuse. In the rain, their effect was multiplied, creating a disorienting wall of flickering light. Through her thermal scope, Naomi watched the chaos unfold. Men stumbled, their night vision equipment worse than useless against the strobes. Their neat formations broke apart as training gave way to confusion. Now it was time to remind them why snipers were so feared in actual combat. Her first shot took out their spotter in the hunter's blind, a tranquilizer round that would leave him with nothing, worse than a hangover. His position would have been dangerous if he'd managed to get her range dialed in. The second shot found their radio man, another non-lethal round that removed their communications capability. In the growing confusion, their tactical advantage was crumbling. "Eagle 1, report." The commander's voice was tense. "Does anyone have eyes on the target?" Naomi's third shot answered his question, the round striking close enough to his feet to spray mud on his boots. A warning shot, delivered with surgical precision. "Spread out," Boone's voice carried over the storm. "She's just one woman. Find her." Another mistake. In the rain and confusion, his men separated, becoming individual targets instead of a coordinated unit. Naomi had seen better-trained fighters make the same error under stress. She switched positions smoothly, moving through pre-planned routes to a new firing location. Always stay mobile, never fire twice from the same spot. Basic sniper doctrine that had served her well in combat zones around the world. The militia members were firing wildly now, burning through ammunition at an unsustainable rate. The professionals tried to maintain discipline, but they were fighting blind, against an enemy they couldn't see, on terrain they didn't know. Lightning flashed again, followed immediately by thunder. The storm was directly overhead now, adding its own percussion to the chaos of combat. Rain pounded the earth, turning the ground into mud that fouled equipment and slowed movement. Through her thermal scope, Naomi watched one of the professional soldiers directing a flanking maneuver. He knew what he was doing. The approach would have worked in normal conditions. But this was her ground, prepared exactly for this situation. The flanking team triggered another set of surprises, flashbangs and smoke grenades that turned their coordinated advance into panicked confusion. In the strobing lights and rain, the smoke created an impenetrable wall that scattered their formation. "Pull back," the commander ordered. "Regroup at the vehicles." But retreat wasn't as simple as they'd imagined. Naomi had prepared the battlefield, carefully creating corridors of fire that forced them to move in predictable directions. Each route exposed them to her pre-sighted firing positions. More non-lethal rounds found their marks. A shot to the shoulder spun one man into the mud. Another caught a mercenary in the leg, dropping him where he stood. Precise shots, delivered, with the skill of someone who'd spent years perfecting their craft. "She's picking us apart," someone screamed over the radio. "We need to pull back." Boone's response was to empty his rifle's magazine at the house, the muzzle flash betraying his position. "Keep pushing. She can't stop all of us." He was right, in theory. Numbers should have been able to overwhelm a single defender. But they weren't fighting a normal opponent, and this wasn't a normal battlefield. Naomi triggered her next set of defenses. Claymore-style devices loaded with rubber bullets and rock salt detonated along their retreat routes. Non-lethal, but incredibly effective at breaking unit cohesion and shattering morale. The professional soldiers recognized the tactic. She was hurting them, using their predictable responses against them. But knowing the trap existed didn't help them escape it. Every route of advance or retreat had been prepared, Every likely tactical decision accounted for. "This is about sending a message," one of the mercenaries said over the radio. "We've delivered it. Time to cut our losses." "No." Boone's voice was desperate now. "We've got her surrounded. Push forward." More lightning illuminated the battlefield. Through her scope, Naomi could see the growing division between Boone's militia members and the professional soldiers. The mercenaries were ready to withdraw. They recognized a losing situation. But Boone's pride wouldn't let him admit defeat. That's when he made his fatal mistake. "Burn it down," he ordered. "Burn everything." The militia members produced Molotov cocktails, their bottles glowing in Naomi's thermal scope. They'd prepared for this, brought incendiary weapons specifically to destroy her home. Time to stop playing nice. Naomi's next shots weren't non-lethal. Precise rounds shattered the bottles before they could be thrown, spraying some of the men with their own accelerant. The message was clear. Escalation would be met with escalation. "She could have killed us any time," the mercenary commander realized aloud. "She's been toying with us." That recognition broke whatever remaining discipline the unit had. Men began running for the vehicles, professional pride forgotten in the face of a superior opponent. They'd come expecting to overwhelm a stubborn farmer. Instead, they'd found themselves facing a skilled operator fighting on prepared ground. Boone tried to rally his forces, screaming orders that were lost in the storm. Lightning flashed again, and in that instant, Naomi put a round through his rifle's receiver, destroying the weapon without harming the man. The message was unmistakable. She could have taken the shot 6 inches higher. Through her scope, she watched. The color drained from Boone's face as he realized how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. His men were fleeing, his hired professionals were retreating, and he stood alone in the rain, facing an enemy he couldn't see. "Fall back," the mercenary commander ordered. "Tactical withdrawal now." The remaining forces broke for their vehicles, abandoning equipment and wounded comrades in their haste to escape. Their retreat was chaos. Engines roaring, tires spinning in mud, men shouting in confusion and fear. Naomi maintained her fire, carefully placed shots hurting them along her chosen route of retreat. She could have killed any of them, could have turned the rain-soaked battlefield into a slaughterhouse. But that wasn't the objective. The objective was to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. As the last vehicle skidded away into the darkness, Naomi began her post-action routine. Check the perimeter, verify that all threats were really gone, account for any equipment they'd left behind. Standard operating procedure, drilled into her through years of combat experience. "Eagle 1, get us out of here," she heard over their radio frequency. "This woman, she's not what we were told." "No shit," another voice responded. "We were set up. This isn't some random farmer. She's military, special forces, maybe even higher." "Boone, you son of a bitch." The commander's voice was cold. "You didn't tell us we'd be going against a professional operator. How was I supposed to know?" Boone's voice was shaky. "She's just some woman who just handed a professional tactical team their asses?" The mercenary cut him off. "We're done. Find someone else to fight your war." Naomi allowed herself a small smile as she switched off the radio. The mercenaries would spread the word through their networks. This farm was off limits. Some targets weren't worth any amount of money. Lightning flashed one final time as she made her way to Elijah's hiding spot. Her son was exactly where she'd left him, the radio still clutched in his hands. "Did we win?" he asked as she helped him up. "For now," Naomi replied, scanning the darkness out of habit. "But Boone's pride won't let him stop here. He'll try something else." They walked back to the house together, checking the damage. The porch was a loss and some windows would need replacing, but her preparations had protected the structure from serious harm. The same couldn't be said for the attacker's pride. "Why didn't you kill them?" Elijah asked suddenly. "You could have, right?" Naomi was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "Killing is easy," she said finally. "Making someone live with their defeat, that's harder, but more effective. They'll remember this night. They'll tell others. And maybe next time, someone will think twice before trying to take what isn't theirs." The rain began to slacken as they secured the house for what remained of the night. In the distance, thunder rumbled. the storm moving on, like the retreating attackers. But they both knew this wasn't over. Boone would be desperate now. His reputation, in tatters, his hired muscle abandoning him. Desperate men did stupid things, dangerous things. The aftermath of the storm left the farm eerily quiet. Dawn revealed discarded weapons, spent shell casings, and deep tire tracks carved into the mud, evidence of the night's battle. Naomi surveyed the damage from her elevated position, her ham radio crackling with intercepted communications. Boone's forces were regrouping, and from what she could hear, they were calling in every favor they had. Alpha team in position. A new voice came through the radio, someone with proper military training judging by their radio discipline. Multiple vehicles incoming from the south. Heavy weapons observed. Naomi keyed her own radio, using the encrypted frequency she shared with Elijah. Status check. I'm okay. Her son's voice came back, steady despite the tension. They're moving through the creek bed, just like you said they would. She'd positioned Elijah in a concealed observation post, far enough from the action to be safe but close enough to provide vital intelligence. He was adapting to their tactical situation with a maturity that made her proud, even as it broke her heart that he had to learn these lessons. The sound of distant engines drew her attention. Through her scope, she counted 5 new vehicles approaching. Military, surplus, probably acquired through less than legal channels. The hardware they were carrying would have been impressive to civilians, but to her trained eye, it just showed their desperation. Come on, Sam, she muttered, checking her watch. Her old teammate had promised reinforcements, but timing would be crucial. Boone's new force looked serious. Someone had supplied them with proper military gear, not just weekend warrior equipment. Her radio crackled again, this time on a secure frequency she hadn't heard in years. Huntress, this is Switchblade. Coming in hot from your 9 o'clock. Confirm visual authentication. Sierra Hotel. A smile crossed Naomi's face as she keyed her response. Hotel Echo Switchblade. Good to hear your voice. Through her scope, she spotted movement in the tree line. Disciplined, professional movement that stood in sharp contrast to Boone's amateur force. Sam Torres and his team were arriving and they'd brought their A-game. Damn, girl, Sam's voice carried a grin. You've got quite a party going on here. Count 12 tangos moving up the East Ridge, another 8 trying to be sneaky by the creek. They've been watching too many action movies, Naomi replied, tracking the militia's movement. No real understanding of proper tactical deployment. Their loss. Sam's voice turned serious. We've got 4 operators in position, all former group guys. Non-lethal loadout as requested, but we can switch to hot if things go sideways. Naomi watched as Boone's force began their advance. They'd learned some lessons from the previous night, better spacing, attempt at coordinated movement. But they still didn't understand the fundamentals of attacking a prepared position. Contact imminent, she reported, noting their approach vectors. They're moving into the kill zones now. The militia's new tactical expert had them advancing in wedge formations, trying to look professional. It might have worked against untrained opposition, but against experienced special forces operators, it just made them predictable. Sam's team struck first. 2 of Boone's men went down to precision shots from suppressed weapons, tranquilizer rounds that would leave them with nothing worse than a headache. The militia's formation immediately broke down, their attempted discipline crumbling under real pressure. Amateur hour, Sam commented as he dropped another militant. These boys think playing soldier in the woods makes them warriors. Naomi triggered her prepared defenses, herding the attackers into channels where Sam's team could engage them efficiently. Flashbangs and smoke grenades created chaos in their ranks, destroying any semblance of unit cohesion. Push forward, Boone's voice carried over the confusion. We've got them outnumbered. Numbers mean nothing without skill, Sam replied. Though, only Naomi could hear him. Watch this. His team executed a perfect flanking maneuver, catching Boone's forces in a crossfire of non-lethal rounds. Men dropped left and right, their expensive tactical gear useless against properly trained operators. Mom, Elijah's voice came through her radio. 3 vehicles trying to circle around behind the house. Copy that, baby. Stay hidden. Naomi switched channels. Sam, we've got flankers trying to be clever. Already on it. Peters and Martinez are moving to intercept. The sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of the attempted flanking maneuver. Boone's men had finally started shooting, spraying ammunition with more enthusiasm than accuracy. "Check your fire," someone screamed, probably their tactical advisor. "Maintain discipline," but it was too late for discipline. Sam's team had them, completely rattled, striking from multiple angles with precise, coordinated attacks. These weren't farmers with rifles anymore. These were trained killers who'd learned their trade in the world's harshest combat zones. Naomi watched through her scope as realization dawned on Boone's face. He'd brought a larger force, better weapons, even some professional advice, but he was still hopelessly outmatched. "Fall back," he ordered, his voice cracking. "Fall back to the vehicles." "Running a little low on ammo here," Sam reported casually, as if he were discussing the weather. "Mind if we use some of theirs? They left plenty lying around." "Help yourself," Naomi replied, tracking targets through her scope. "Consider it a gift for coming to the party." The militia's retreat was rapidly becoming a rout. Men abandoned their weapons, running for the relative safety of their vehicles. The expensive tactical gear that had made them feel like warriors now just weighed them down as they fled. "Want us to pursue?" Sam asked, but Naomi knew it wasn't necessary. Let them go. They got the message. Through her radio, she could hear their tactical advisor cursing. "They've got professional operators, military trained, probably special forces. We weren't told about this." "Boone, you idiot," another voice added. "You said this would be easy money. You didn't say anything about going up against real soldiers." Naomi allowed herself a grim smile as she watched their vehicles retreat in disorder. They'd come expecting to overwhelm a single woman through superior numbers and firepower. Instead, they'd run headlong into a team of experienced combat veterans who'd spent years perfecting the art of warfare. Sam's team emerged from their positions once the area was clear, moving with the fluid grace of practiced operators. They swept the battlefield, securing abandoned weapons and checking on the tranquilized militia members. "Just like old times," Sam said as he approached Naomi's position. He looked older than when she'd last seen him, gray threading his dark hair, but his movements were still those of a trained warrior. "Though usually we were dealing with actual fighters, not these wannabes." "They're dangerous enough," Naomi replied, scanning the area one final time before slinging her rifle. "Desperate men with guns don't have to be skilled to be a threat." "True enough." Sam gestured to his team as they worked. "We'll help you clean up, set up some new defensive positions. These boys aren't done yet." "No," Naomi agreed, watching. Elijah emerged from his observation post. "Boone's pride won't let him walk away. He'll try something else. Then we'll be ready." Sam's face hardened as he watched Elijah approach. "Targeting a kid? That crosses a line. My team's with you for the duration, whatever you need." The rest of the morning was spent fortifying positions and gathering intelligence. Sam's team had brought sophisticated surveillance equipment, which they set up around the perimeter. No one would be able to approach the farm without being detected. "Your son handles himself well," Sam commented as they watched Elijah help Peters set up a motion sensor. "You've trained him right." "I never wanted him to need this training," Naomi replied softly. "I thought we could have a normal life here." "Normal's overrated." Sam checked his weapon with practiced ease. "Besides, some fights choose you, whether you want them or not." Through their surveillance network, they monitored Boone's forces regrouping at their staging area. The militia's numbers had been cut nearly in half, with many of their warriors deciding that attacking a fortified position held by special forces operators wasn't worth any amount of money. "They're arguing about what to do next," Martinez reported, monitoring their radio communications. "The professional advisors want to cut their losses. Boone's trying to hold them together, but he's losing control." "Good," Sam replied. "Divided. Forces make mistakes. We can use that." Naomi spent the afternoon working with Sam's team to prepare for different scenarios. They set up interlocking fields of fire, prepared fallback positions, and established a comprehensive defense plan that would make any military commander proud. "Remember Kandahar?" Sam asked as they worked. "That time we held off an entire Taliban unit with just 4 operators." "This is different," Naomi replied, though she appreciated the comparison. "These aren't trained fighters. They're scared men being pushed into something they don't understand. Makes them more dangerous in some ways," Sam observed. "Desperate. Men do desperate things." As if to prove his point, their surveillance picked up a disturbing conversation at Boone's position. They were discussing using explosives, trying to destroy the farm entirely if they couldn't drive Naomi out. "They're getting serious," Martinez reported. "Someone's made some calls, brought in heavy weapons. This isn't militia equipment anymore. This is military-grade hardware." "Briggs must be pulling strings," Sam mused. "Wonder who he's got in his pocket besides the local sheriff." Naomi thought about the real estate developer, about the desperation in his eyes when he'd visited the farm. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about power, about control, about men who couldn't stand being defied. "Mom," Elijah called from his observation post. "Movement in the tree line. They're trying to set up firing positions." "Good eye," Sam praised, checking through his scope. "They're establishing a perimeter, planning something big." The afternoon wore on, tension building as both sides prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Boone's remaining forces were being reinforced by new arrivals, more militia members drawn by promises of easy money and the chance to prove themselves. "They're up to about 30 effectives now," Peters reported. "Better equipped than before, but still no real unit cohesion." "Numbers won't help them," Sam replied confidently. "Quality beats quantity every time." As dusk approached, Naomi gathered her team for a final briefing. Sam's operators listened intently as she outlined their defensive strategy, adding their own suggestions based on years of combat experience. "Remember," she concluded, "non-lethal force unless absolutely necessary. We're not here to kill anyone, just to send a message they won't forget." "They're already getting the message," Martinez observed, monitoring the militia's communications. "Half of them want to leave now. Only Boone's pride and Briggs's money are holding them together." "Pride and money," Sam shook his head. "Two things that have gotten a lot of would-be warriors killed over the years." Night fell across the farm as final preparations were made. Sam's team moved to their assigned positions, their movements invisible in the darkness. These were men who'd learned their trade in the world's harshest combat zones, against enemies who'd been fighting their entire lives. "Just like old times," Sam's voice came through her radio as they waited. "Though usually we were the ones attacking fortified positions." "Different perspective this time," Naomi replied, checking her weapon one final time. "Fighting for something that matters." Through her night vision scope, she watched Boone's forces preparing for what they hoped would be their final assault. They had the numbers, the weapons, even some tactical knowledge now. But they still didn't understand what they were really facing. They saw a farm defended by a handful of operators. They didn't see the years of combat experience, the countless battles survived, the lessons learned in blood and fire. Morning brought a tense calm to the town as news of the failed assault spread through local circles. Joe's diner buzzed with whispered conversations. Locals hunched over coffee cups as they discussed the events at the Carter farm. The regular breakfast crowd had swelled with curious onlookers, all eager for any scrap of information about the woman who'd single-handedly defeated Boone's militia. Sheriff Holden sat at his usual corner booth, but his typical morning swagger was noticeably absent. His hands shook slightly as he lifted his coffee cup, eyes darting nervously whenever the diner's door opened. The presence of unknown military-type men in town had him on edge. Professionals who might start asking uncomfortable questions about his involvement with Boone and Briggs. "Another coffee, Sheriff?" Martha, the elderly waitress, asked with barely concealed contempt. Like many in town, she'd heard about his deputies standing idle while Boone's men attacked the farm. "Just the check," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. The weight of his choices was becoming apparent as the town's mood shifted. Outside, a convoy of unmarked vehicles rolled through Main Street, Sam's team conducting reconnaissance. Their presence added another layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. These weren't Boone's weekend warriors playing soldier. These were real operators whose very bearing commanded respect. At the farm, Naomi and Sam reviewed their intelligence over breakfast. Martinez had spent the night monitoring local communications, building a clear picture of the changing dynamics. Towns splitting into camps, Martinez reported, spreading out a map marked with various locations and names. About 60% are still keeping their heads down, trying to stay neutral. But the rest are picking sides. Sam pointed to several marked locations. Veterans groups are rallying behind you. That gun shop owner, Mike Williams, has been turning away Boone's men, says he won't sell to terrorists. The VFW hall has become a gathering point for supporters. Martinez added, lot of old soldiers who recognize what you are, what you represent. They're not all fighters anymore, but they've got influence in town. Naomi studied the map, noting the patterns of support and opposition. And the others? Mostly tied to Briggs financially, Sam explained. People who've taken his money who depend on his developments, plus the usual mix who just don't like change or don't like seeing a black woman stand up to the old power. Structure, Naomi finished. Tell me about Briggs. What's he doing? Martinez pulled out several surveillance photos. He's been making calls all morning. High-level contacts from what we can intercept. Someone's pulling strings to get Boone military-grade hardware. A truck engine announced Elijah's return from his morning reconnaissance. The boy had adapted to their tactical situation with remarkable resilience, turning his paper route into valuable intelligence gathering. "Mom," he called as he entered, excitement breaking through his usual careful demeanor. "You need to hear this. The grocery store. Mr. Thompson is telling everyone what really happened with the sheriff." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "He was there when Sheriff Holden took money from Briggs right in the store's back office. Says he's got security camera footage." Sam whistled low. "That could be useful. Proper leverage at the right moment." The morning progressed with more revelations as the town's true dynamics came to light. Martha from the diner called to report that several of Boone's injured men had been treated at the clinic, where Dr. Sarah Jensen had documented their wounds and their admissions of participating in an armed assault. "Evidence," Sam noted with approval, "building a legal case while we build our defenses." But not all the news was positive. Reports came in of intimidation against their supporters. The gun shop owner's windows had been smashed. The VFW hall's walls were painted with threats. Briggs's influence ran deep and he wasn't afraid to use it. Around noon, an unexpected visitor arrived at the farm. Thomas Wright, a retired Marine Corps colonel who'd been quietly observing events, requested a meeting. Sam's team vetted him thoroughly before allowing him through their security perimeter. "Ms. Carter," Wright said as he settled into a kitchen chair, his bearing still military straight despite his age. "I've been watching how you handle yourself. Your group, aren't you? Special Forces?" Naomi studied him carefully before nodding. No point denying it to another operator. "Thought so. That takedown of Boone's assault, textbook SF tactics." He leaned forward, eyes intense. "There are more of us in town than you might think. Veterans who haven't forgotten our oaths to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic." "And Boone qualifies as domestic?" Sam asked from his position. "By the window. Armed militia attacking a civilian? Terrorizing a community? Damn right he qualifies." Wright pulled out a notebook. "I've been keeping track. Names, dates, connections, everything linking Briggs and Boone to corrupt officials. Even got documentation of illegal weapons transfers. This was valuable intelligence, the kind that could shift the balance beyond just tactical considerations." Naomi and Sam exchanged glances as Wright continued. "Sheriff's not the only one on Briggs's payroll," Wright explained. "County commissioner, 2 council members, even the head of the Chamber of Commerce. They've been helping him pressure people to sell their land cheap, using Boone's thugs as muscle." "Why tell us this now?" Naomi asked. "Because you're the first person who stood up to them and had the skills to back it up." Wright's voice carried the weight of conviction. "This town needs a reckoning, needs someone to break Briggs's grip." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention. Through the window, they watched a news van from the regional station pull up to their gate. Sam's team had it contained quickly, but the implications were clear. This story was growing beyond local bounds. "That's going to complicate things," Sam observed. "Or simplify them," Naomi countered. "Harder for Briggs to operate in the shadows with media attention." The afternoon brought more developments. Martinez intercepted a heated argument between Boone and Briggs, the developer furious about the failed assault. "I don't care what it costs," Briggs was shouting. "I've got investors breathing down my neck. That land is the key to the whole development." "Handle it! Handle it!" Boone's voice was strained. "You trying handling a special forces sniper and her backup team. These aren't regular folks we're dealing with." "Then get better men. I've made calls. People are coming who know how to deal with this kind of problem permanently." The threat hung in the air, clear and deadly. Briggs was escalating, moving beyond local muscle to something more dangerous. "We need to get ahead of this," Sam said after hearing the recording. "Cut off his options before his reinforcements arrive." Naomi agreed, but her attention was drawn to movement at their perimeter. One of Sam's team was escorting Martha from the diner, the elderly waitress clutching a paper bag. "Brought you some pie," Martha announced as she entered the kitchen. "And information." Overheard Briggs making calls. "He's got connections to some private military company, real mercenaries. They're flying in tonight." The intelligence was valuable, but it was Martha's next words that caught everyone's attention. "Town's meeting at the church tonight. Secret meeting. Those of us who want to help, want to stop this before it gets worse." She looked at Naomi with fierce determination. "We may not be soldiers, but this is our town too." The afternoon turned to evening as more pieces fell into place. Wright's veteran network began quietly mobilizing, establishing observation posts throughout town. The gun shop owner distributed radios tuned to secure frequencies. Dr. Jensen prepared emergency medical supplies. "Never thought I'd see the day," Sam mused as they watched the activity. Whole town turning into a resistance network. But not everyone was joining their cause. Briggs's supporters were also mobilizing, setting up checkpoints, monitoring movements. The town was effectively splitting in two, battle lines being drawn through the heart of the community. Sheriff Holden made one last attempt to assert control, calling a press conference to denounce outside agitators causing trouble. But his credibility crumbled when Thompson, the grocery store owner, released the security footage of their backroom dealing. As night fell, Naomi received word that the church meeting was starting. She couldn't attend personally. Her farm was still the focal point of defense, but Elijah relayed updates through their secure channel. "Standing room only," he reported. "Mr. Thompson is showing evidence of corruption. Dr. Jensen's presenting medical records of militia violence. People are angry, Mom. They're tired of being afraid." The meeting marked a turning point. Decades of quiet corruption and intimidation were being dragged into the light. People who'd stayed silent out of fear were finding their voices, their courage bolstered by Naomi's example. "This is how real change happens," Wright observed as they monitored the situation. One person stands up, shows others it's possible, creates a ripple effect, but victory wasn't certain. Even as the townspeople organized, Briggs's mercenaries were en route, professional killers with no connection to the community, no reason to show restraint. "We've got movement," Martinez reported suddenly. "Multiple vehicles approaching from the north. Military grade, definitely not local." Through their surveillance equipment, they watched the new arrivals. The difference was immediately apparent. These weren't militia playing soldier. Their movements, their equipment, their very bearing marked them as experienced operators. "What's the plan?" Sam asked, watching Naomi study the tactical situation. "We hold the farm," she replied firmly. "It's not just about the land anymore. It's about showing people they don't have to live in fear." As if to emphasize her point, more vehicles were arriving, but these were their supporters. Veterans with tactical experience, townspeople with valuable skills, all coming together to stand against corruption. "Never thought I'd see the day," Martha said as she helped organize supplies. "This town's been under Briggs's thumb so long, people forgot what it meant to fight back." The night deepened as both sides prepared for what was coming. Briggs's mercenaries established their base at his office complex, their presence a clear escalation. But they weren't facing a single farmer anymore. They were facing a community that had finally found its courage. Got some interesting chatter, Martinez reported, monitoring communications. Mercenaries aren't happy. They came expecting a simple intimidation job. Finding out they're up against special forces and organized resistance? That wasn't in the contract. Fear works both ways, Sam observed. Professional soldiers know the difference between bullying civilians and facing trained operators. Through their surveillance network, they watched the town transform. The VFW hall became a command center, coordinating civilian support. The clinic prepared for casualties. The local ham radio network hummed with encrypted communications. This is more than just defending a farm now, Wright said, watching the activity. This is about taking back our town. Naomi stood on her porch, watching the distant lights of vehicles moving through the night. Tomorrow would bring violence. Professional mercenaries weren't known for backing down easily. But they wouldn't be fighting alone. Mom, Elijah's voice came through the radio. More people arriving at the church. They're organizing teams, just like you showed them. Everyone wants to help. She smiled in the darkness, pride mixing with determination. One person standing up had become many. Fear was being replaced by resolve. The first rays of dawn hadn't yet touched the horizon when Naomi's surveillance network detected the approaching force. Through her thermal scope, she counted 40 vehicles moving in tight formation, the largest assault group yet. Boone had gathered every ally he could find, combining his local militia with Briggs's hired mercenaries for one final push. Multiple heat signatures, Martinez reported from his observation post. I count at least 60 armed individuals. Professional, operators mixed with militia. They're running encrypted comms, military-grade equipment. Sam's voice crackled through their secure channel. They're splitting into 3 groups, main force coming straight up the road, 2 flanking elements moving through the woods. Someone with actual tactical training is coordinating. Naomi watched. The mercenaries deploy with practiced efficiency. These weren't weekend warriors anymore. These were professionals who'd learned their trade in the world's combat zones. But they were fighting for money. She was fighting for something more. All units, check in, she ordered, falling into the familiar rhythm of combat command. Alpha team in position, Sam reported. His veterans had established defensive positions around the farm's perimeter. Bravo team ready, Wright's voice was steady. The retired Marine had organized the local veterans into an effective support force. Charlie team standing by, Dr. Jensen confirmed. Her medical team was prepared for casualties with evacuation routes planned. Town network active, Martha added. Their civilian supporters were monitoring movements, ready to provide intelligence and support. Elijah's voice came last, from his secure observation post. They're moving into the first kill zone, Mom. Just like you predicted. Naomi allowed herself a moment of pride in her son's tactical awareness before focusing on the threat. Through her scope, she watched Boone organizing his forces. He'd learned from his previous failures, keeping his men in proper formation, maintaining fire discipline. The mercenary commander was easy to spot. His movements showed years of professional training. He was setting up interlocking fields of fire, establishing proper support positions. This wouldn't be like the previous attacks. They're deploying heavy weapons, Martinez warned. 50 cal mounted on the lead vehicle. RPGs in the second line. Acknowledged, Naomi replied calmly. All units, execute Phase 1. The first explosion caught the mercenaries' advance element completely by surprise. Not a lethal blast, but powerful enough to disable their lead vehicle and scatter their formation. Sam's team had spent days preparing the battlefield, turning every approach into a deadly maze. Contact front, someone screamed over the mercenaries' channel. Minefield! Minefield! Push through, Boone's voice carried over the chaos. We've got the numbers this time. But numbers meant nothing against proper preparation. As the mercenaries tried to regroup, Naomi's defenders struck from multiple angles. Precision fire from concealed positions forced them to seek cover that wasn't there. 2 down, Sam reported as his team engaged the flanking element. Non-lethal rounds, but they'll have headaches when they wake up. The mercenary commander showed his experience, quickly adapting to the situation. Bravo, team. Lay down suppressing. Fire. Charlie team, find those shooters. But Naomi had anticipated this response. Wright's veterans triggered their prepared defenses, filling the air with smoke and strobes. In the confusion, more precision shots found their targets. They're trying to flank wide, Elijah reported from his position. Moving through the creek bed. Copy that, Naomi acknowledged. Martinez, show them why that's a bad idea. The creek bed erupted with flashbangs and rubber bullets, driving the flanking force back into prepared kill zones. The mercenaries were good, but they were fighting on unfamiliar ground against an enemy who'd planned for every contingency. Pull back, someone shouted as another vehicle was disabled. We're getting slaughtered. Stand your ground, Boone screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. We've got them surrounded. Surrounded? The mercenary commander's voice dripped with contempt. We're the ones being hunted, you fool. These aren't amateurs we're fighting. Through her scope, Naomi watched the growing division in the enemy ranks. The mercenaries were professionals. They could recognize a losing situation, but Boone's pride wouldn't let him accept defeat. Briggs is paying us enough to handle this, Boone insisted. Push forward. Paying us to die, you mean? One of the mercenaries muttered. This position is compromised. We need to withdraw and reassess. The battle shifted as the mercenaries began fighting defensively, more concerned with survival than victory. But Boone's militia pressed forward, driven by their leader's desperate orders. Mom? Elijah's voice was urgent. Boone's breaking away from the main group. He's got something in his hands. Looks like explosives. Naomi's blood ran cold. A desperate man with explosives was the worst kind of threat. All units be advised. Boone is armed with explosives. Consider him maximum threat. Through her thermal scope, she tracked Boone's movement. He was working his way toward the house, using the chaos of battle as cover. The device in his hands was crude but deadly, probably homemade explosives packed for maximum damage. Sam, can you intercept? Negative, Sam replied, the sound of gunfire in the background. Pinned down by their heavy weapons. Naomi made her decision instantly. Right, take over coordination. I'm moving to engage. She shifted positions smoothly, years of training taking over as she tracked her target. Boone was moving with the desperate energy of a man with nothing left to lose, barely checking for threats as he approached the house. The battle continued around them, mercenaries and militia fighting Naomi's defenders in an elaborate dance of attack and counterattack. But her world narrowed to the single threat advancing on her home. Got eyes on you, Mom, Elijah reported. He's 20 yards from the west entrance, moving fast. Naomi moved faster, circling through prepared routes to cut off Boone's approach. Through her thermal scope, she could see the crude explosive device clearly now, enough power to level the house if he got close enough. Stop right there, Boone, she called out, her voice carrying across the battlefield. It's over. He spun toward her voice, explosives clutched to his chest like a shield. Over? It's not over until I say it's over. This is my town, my territory. Your town? Naomi kept her rifle trained on him as she moved closer. Look around you. Look what you've done to your town. The sounds of battle were fading as more mercenaries withdrew, leaving Boone's militia to fight alone. In the distance, sirens wailed, state police finally responding to reports of armed conflict. Should have just sold the farm, Boone growled, his finger tightening on the detonator. Should have known your place. My place? Naomi's voice was ice. My place is right here, defending my home against terrorists like you. Terrorists? Boone laughed, the sound edged with hysteria. We're patriots. We're protecting our way of life. Your way of life? Naomi moved with practiced grace, closing the distance. You mean intimidation? Corruption? Attacking families because they won't bow to your demands? Through her earpiece, she could hear the battle turning. The mercenaries were retreating in force now, leaving Boone's militia to face the consequences alone. Professional soldiers knew when a fight was lost. If I can't have this town, Boone raised the detonator, nobody can. Naomi's shot was perfect, years of training, distilled into a single precise moment. The rubber bullet struck Boone's hand, sending the detonator flying before his fingers could close on the trigger. He screamed in pain and rage, reaching for a pistol at his belt. But Naomi was already moving, closing the distance with Predator. Grace. Her rifle swung up, cracking against his jaw with precise force. Boone went down hard, but desperation gave him strength. He lunged for her legs, trying to grapple. It was exactly the wrong move against a trained combat veteran. Naomi's knee found his solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs. Her elbow caught his temple as he gasped for breath. Each strike was measured, precise, enough force to subdue, without killing. "It's over, Boone," she said as he struggled to rise. "Your mercenaries are gone. Your militia is surrendering. The state police are coming. It's done." "Never," he gasped, blood trickling from his split lip. "This is my town." "Not anymore." The final blow was almost gentle, a precise strike to the nerve cluster at the base of his skull. Boone collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, unconscious before he hit the ground. Naomi secured his weapons with practiced efficiency, then keyed her radio. "Target secured. Explosives contained. Status report." "Mercenaries in full retreat," Sam reported. "Militia forces surrendering. Minimal casualties. No serious injuries." "Medical team standing by," Dr. Jensen added. "Mostly bruises and sprains. Your non-lethal tactics worked perfectly." Through her scope, Naomi watched the battle's end. Militia members were dropping their weapons, hands raised as rights veterans secured them. The mercenaries were long gone, leaving their employers to face the consequences alone. "Mom?" Elijah's voice carried pride mixed with concern. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, baby." She secured Boone's unconscious form with zip ties. "It's over. We won." State police vehicles were arriving now, lights flashing as they surrounded the area. But they weren't the only ones coming. News vans followed close behind, cameras already rolling to capture the aftermath. "Ms. Carter." Thompson, the grocery store owner, called out as he approached with Martha. "We've got Briggs. Caught him trying to flee town with a briefcase full of documents. Everything's there. Proof of corruption, illegal weapons sales, all of it." Naomi nodded, watching as more townspeople emerged from their positions. The battle had united them in ways Briggs and Boone never expected. Fear had been replaced by determination, isolation by community. "The FBI's on their way," Wright reported, approaching with his rifle slung. "Got some friends in the bureau. Once they see the evidence, Briggs and his whole network are going down." Sam's team regrouped around Naomi, their weapons ready but pointed down. Professional soldiers who'd fought beside her before, who understood what it meant to defend something worth fighting for. "Just like old times," Sam grinned, though his eyes were serious. "Though usually we're ghosting out before the authorities arrive." "Different kind of mission," Naomi replied, watching as state police began processing the militia members. "Different kind of victory." The sun was fully up now, revealing the battlefield in stark detail. Disabled vehicles littered the approaches to the farm. Unconscious or zip-tied militia members were being loaded into police vehicles. Evidence teams were already documenting everything. Through it all, Naomi stood watching, her rifle held ready, but not threatening. She'd fought this battle on multiple levels, tactical, strategic, and moral. She'd defended her home without taking lives, protected her community without becoming what she fought against. "Mom!" Elijah ran to her, his observation duty complete. She caught him in a one-armed hug, keeping her weapon ready out of habit. "You did good, baby," she said softly. "Real good." "We all did," he replied, looking around at their gathered allies. Martha was distributing coffee and sandwiches. Dr. Jensen was treating minor injuries. Wright's veterans were securing weapons and evidence. The farm had become more than just her home. It had become a symbol of resistance against corruption, a rally point for a community that had finally found its courage. "What happens now?" Elijah asked, as they watched state police lead Boone away. Naomi looked at her son, seeing the strength that had grown in him through this crucible. "Now we rebuild, we heal. We make sure nothing like this happens again." The morning sun cast long shadows across the battlefield. As the community began the process of recovery, there would be investigations, trials, consequences for those who'd chosen violence over justice. But more importantly, there would be change. The kind of change that comes when people stand together against corruption, when one person's courage inspires others to find their own strength. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the farm as FBI evidence teams combed through the battlefield. Shell casings glinted in the grass, numbered markers dotting the ground like strange flowers. Naomi watched from her porch as federal agents documented everything, every bullet hole, every piece of abandoned equipment, every sign of the war that had been fought here. Special Agent Sarah Collins approached, her badge catching the light. "Ms. Carter, I have to say, in 15 years with the Bureau, I've never seen anything quite like this. A whole town standing up against corruption, led by a former Green Beret. Sometimes people just need to see it's possible to fight back," Naomi replied, watching Elijah help the agents mark evidence locations. Her son moved with new confidence now, the kind that comes from facing fear and surviving. In town, the changes were already visible. Sheriff Holden's deputy was leading him, out of the station in handcuffs, photographers capturing every moment. The evidence Thompson had provided, years of documented corruption, was proving devastating. Briggs sat in a federal holding cell, his expensive suit wrinkled, his perfect hair disheveled. His attempted escape had ended at a roadblock manned by rights veterans. The briefcase he'd tried to destroy contained everything the FBI needed: proof of bribes, illegal weapons purchases, connections to criminal enterprises. "Your testimony will be crucial," Agent Collins continued. "The Bureau's been trying to crack this network for years. Briggs isn't just a corrupt developer. He's part of a larger organization using militia groups for illegal land grabs across multiple states." Sam approached, his tactical gear exchanged for civilian clothes. "Just got word from my contacts. The mercenary company Briggs hired? They're already cooperating, turning over evidence to save themselves. Professional soldiers know when to cut their losses." The day progressed with a steady stream of revelations. Dr. Jensen provided medical records documenting years of militia violence. Martha shared recordings of conversations overheard at the diner. The town's silent witnesses were finally speaking out. At the county jail, Boone Walker sat in isolation, his world crumbling around him. His militia was scattered, its members either in custody or cooperating with authorities. The facade of power he'd built through intimidation had shattered completely. "He's talking," Agent Collins reported later that evening. "Trying to make a deal. Says he can provide information about other militia groups, other corrupt officials." Naomi nodded, unsurprised. Men like Boone were always brave until consequences caught up with them. Then they remembered how to be scared. The media descended on the town, drawn by the story of corruption and resistance. News vans lined Main Street as reporters interviewed locals, each person adding their piece to the larger narrative. "Former Green Beret leads community against corruption," one headline read. "Small town stands up to criminal enterprise," declared another. The story was spreading, inspiring similar communities to examine their own power structures. As night fell, Naomi gathered with her allies in the rebuilt barn. Sam's team was preparing to leave, their mission complete. Rights veterans had established a community watch program to fill the gap left by the compromised sheriff's department. "Town council's holding emergency sessions," Martha reported, serving coffee to the gathered group. "Voting to remove everyone connected to Briggs, special elections next month. The hardware store's reopening," Thompson added. "First time in years without paying protection money. Others are following suit." Dr. Jensen smiled tiredly. "Had 3 families come back to town already. People who left because of Boone's threats. They heard what happened, want to be part of rebuilding." Naomi listened to their reports, seeing how the community had transformed. The fear that had kept people isolated was gone, replaced by a sense of shared purpose. "Mom?" Elijah's voice drew her attention. "Do we still need the security systems, the hidden bunker?" She considered her son's question carefully. "We keep them maintained, not out of fear, but because being prepared isn't the same as being afraid. The following weeks brought more changes. Federal investigations expanded, following evidence trails that led to other towns, other corrupt networks. Briggs's organization was unraveling, its influence exposed to sunlight like rot under fallen logs. The farm became a symbol, drawing visitors from other communities facing similar struggles. Naomi found herself teaching others what she'd learned, not just tactical skills, but the importance of community resistance against corruption. Sam called regularly, keeping her updated on broader developments. Similar patterns showing up across the country, he reported. Corrupt developers using militant groups for intimidation. But now people know it can be fought. Elijah returned to school, but with a different perspective. The bullies who'd once tormented him now kept their distance, not from fear, but from respect. He carried himself with quiet confidence, knowing he'd faced real danger and survived. The town began healing, like a body recovering from disease. New businesses opened. Community meetings drew large crowds. People learned to trust their neighbors again. 3 months after the battle, Naomi stood on her porch watching the sun set over her fields. The farm was flourishing, the land responding to care and attention. The scars of conflict were fading, replaced by new growth. Looks peaceful, Wright observed, joining her with 2 cups of coffee. The retired Marine had become a regular visitor, helping coordinate the community's ongoing transformation. Peace through strength, Naomi replied, accepting the coffee. Not just military strength, community strength. In town, the changes were becoming permanent. The new sheriff, elected by an overwhelming majority, had instituted reforms to prevent future corruption. The town council, led by fresh faces, focused on transparent governance and community involvement. Federal trials began, making headlines across the country. Briggs, facing multiple felony charges, tried to bargain with prosecutors, but the evidence was too strong, the witnesses too numerous. His network of corruption was exposed completely. Boone received a lengthy sentence, his claims of patriotism falling flat against documented evidence of violence and intimidation. The judge, unimpressed by his attempts at justification, ensured he'd have years to reflect on his choices. Sheriff Holden turned state's evidence, revealing deeper connections between corrupt officials and criminal enterprises. His testimony helped federal authorities identify similar patterns in other communities. 6 months after the battle, Naomi agreed to help establish a training program, not to create militants, but to teach communities how to recognize and resist corruption, how to stand together against intimidation. It's not about fighting, she explained to her first class, a mix of community leaders from across the country. It's about refusing to be afraid, about turning individual courage into collective strength. Elijah helped with the training, sharing lessons learned during their struggle. His perspective, a child forced to confront corruption, resonated deeply with parents in similar situations. The farm prospered as autumn painted the fields in gold and crimson. The rebuilt barn stood stronger than before, a symbol of resilience. The land that Briggs had coveted remained free, protected not just by one former Green Beret, but by an entire community. A year after the battle, Naomi watched new families, moving into homes that had stood empty under Boone's reign of terror. Children played in yards where people had once feared to gather. The town had transformed from a place of fear to one of hope. Sam visited occasionally, bringing news of similar transformations in other communities. The example set by one small town had sparked a movement, inspiring others to stand against corruption. "You started something bigger than you know," he told her during one visit. People needed to see it was possible to fight back and win. Elijah, now 13, had grown into his new role as a community leader's son. He balanced school with helping teach others, sharing their story with visiting groups. "Sometimes people ask if I was scared," he told his mother one evening. "I tell them being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right anyway. Just like you taught me." The final chapter of their story played out in federal court, where Briggs faced sentencing. His empire had crumbled, his corruption exposed. But more importantly, his power to intimidate was gone, destroyed not by federal authorities, but by a community that had learned to stand together. Standing on her porch that last evening, watching the sun set over her free fields, Naomi reflected on their journey. She'd come seeking peace but found a war worth fighting. She'd wanted to escape her past, but found her skills were needed for a different kind of battle. "Do you think it's really over?" Elijah asked, joining her on the porch. "This chapter is," she replied, putting an arm around her son. "But the work continues. There are always people who try to take what isn't theirs, who use fear to control others, and there are always people who need to learn how to stand against them." Peace had come at last to the farm, to the town, to the community. Not the false peace of fear and submission, but the true peace of justice and strength. The peace that comes from knowing you've fought the good fight, not just for yourself, but for something larger. The peace they'd made for themselves and would never stop fighting to maintain. If this story of a former Green Beret turned farmer resonated with you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of extraordinary people who remind us that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought in war zones, but right here at home. From small-town heroes to legendary warriors, we've got more stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.